Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today is an exciting one because I'm going to be reviewing the Canon R5, which I'm filming on right now, after using it for an entire year. As you may or may not know, the Canon R5 kind of broke the internet when it was announced. The specs were just off the charts with 4K 60, 4K 120, and 8K RAW. This camera, to say the least, made quite an impact in the photography / videography world when it was announced. I was so excited to get my hands on one, and it took 89 days for it to come after ordering it. It was so back ordered, it was crazy. Like, it was nearly impossible to get your hands on an R5 at the time. But after 1 year later, after an entire year of using this thing on professional shoots constantly, is it worth the hype? And is it worth your money? Because let's be real here, this camera is not cheap. At $3,900, this is a lot of money, not to mention you obviously don't get a lens with that, and the RF glass, which is amazing, and we'll get to that later, is also not cheap by any means. My whole setup, which is just a 15-35 2.8, and the camera, cost about $6,000, which is nuts. So investing in Canon mirrorless right now is a huge commitment, to say the least. So is this the perfect camera? I would say mostly yes. So let's dive right in and talk about what I like about this camera. The Canon R5 is probably one of the most future-proofed cameras to date. With ridiculous specs like 45 megapixels, 4K 120, and 8K RAW, this camera blows it out of the water as far as quality. However, as you may have heard, there's been a lot of issues regarding overheating and time limits, and just some weird caveats with the higher quality recording modes. I do have to say this, I have never had my camera overheat out of an entire year of using it. I have used 8K, I have used 4K 120 in small bursts, and I have never had it overheat. That was one of the biggest concerns with this camera because that was such a large issue. And if you're not the type of person who's gonna, sit down this camera and record for more than 20-30 minutes in 8K or 4K 120, then, it isn't for you. But then again, if that's what you need, you probably shouldn't be putting your money into a mirrorless camera like this. A mirrorless or a DSLR is not gonna cut it for you. You're probably looking at a cinema camera anyway. And as I mentioned that this was a very future-proof camera, I'll be honest, I really struggled using this thing when it first came out. Not to mention, C-Log was just a nightmare to use. I literally couldn't watch like 5 seconds of footage in C-Log, even in 1080, because the files were just so difficult for my computer to interpret at the time. So over that course of time, I would have to make proxies for videos constantly. The photos were fantastic, and we'll get to photos in a minute, but the video clips were just so hard to edit, it would crash my computer constantly, and I had to start using a proxy workflow. And if you're not familiar with that term, basically what happens is you make copies of your video clips in a lower quality so that your video editing software can handle editing that, and then once you're about to export, you swap out those actual files, and then you get your actual video. But doing that takes a lot of time, and it's no fun because you just want to throw in your footage and get to work. You don't want to have to add all these extra steps and then add all this extra time that you're waiting for these files to transcode. It's a whole nightmare. And in fact, I did make a cinematic video testing the 8K in the camera, so if you're interested in seeing what this has to offer, you can go ahead and watch that. But obviously, I would have to use proxies for 8K as well, because those were tough. But that's why I say this camera was future-proofed, because the limitations of this camera weren't the camera itself, it was that technology had not caught up to be able to support what this camera could offer, if that makes sense. But with the announcement of the brand new M1 Pro and M1 Max chips, I am so excited to test the R5 to its full capabilities, and you can expect tons of content on the new MacBook, and I did end up buying the most expensive M1 configuration, and I hopefully won't regret it. Technology has finally caught up to where this camera can really shine. I won't have to make proxies constantly all the time, and to my knowledge, I should be able to edit in 8K with no problems at all on these new M1 devices. I'm so excited to try that out. But basically, my frustrations with the camera weren't with the camera itself. It's just that, like I mentioned, my computer, my hardware cannot keep up with what this camera was offering. I'm just really excited for these new laptops because it will speed up everything that this camera has to offer. And finally, the camera and technology to handle that camera match, and I can finally use the camera to its fullest ability. So I will try to be as objective as I can here, but take this as someone who has used both Canon and Sony professionally. The Canon R5, as far as photography goes, is probably the best photography camera on the market by a long shot. 45 megapixels is ridiculous. I can count my eyebrows in pictures. The dual pixel autofocus is incredibly accurate. The face autofocus is so good too. It just sticks right to the eye. Like, it is just stuck to my eye so well. It is not going anywhere. And I've got to say, this is the happiest that I've been with an autofocus in any camera. The quality of the pictures are just amazing. They look better than life. I love how they look. So as someone who owns an A7 R3 and have used this as a photography camera as well, this having 42 megapixels, and I know that people are like, Canon colors and Sony and bleh, and my skin tones and bleh. Like, that's a whole thing. That's just bleh. I think you can get similar looks out of both because I've used them both and no one can tell. Me personally, I tend to lean more in favor of Canon's image right out of the camera. So take that how you will. But I use both. I like both. I will continue to use both, and one will not supersede the other because at the end of the day, they're just the tools that you use, and it doesn't define who you are or define your work. It's just what you use. It's just preference. One thing that I was really excited about was the tilty flippy screen, which I'm so happy is in the camera. But Sony's little bleh, like, ugh, I hate that. I hate it. And luckily Sony's been putting tilty flippy screens in there too. But yeah, all cameras should. For the end of time. There's no reason you shouldn't do that. Okay, anyway, rant over on that. And another thing that is really amazing about the R5 is the high quality 4K. I would argue it's very comparable to 8K. So what's happening is it takes the full 8K sensor and smushes all of that into a glorious, beautiful 4K image that is way better than the 4K non-HQ version. It looks awesome. It looks like pictures. Like I could just take a frame out of a video and it could be a picture. I can't explain it. It looks so good. So now to pros and cons. And this could be a bad thing or a good thing depending on how you look at it. But the lenses in the RF mount are not cheap. By any means, they are not cheap. There are definitely not budget lenses for the RF quite yet. We're still getting there, but they are new. They are innovative and they are pretty thought through. One thing that I really like about the RF lenses is they have this extra control ring on the front that you can program to change your aperture or change your shutter speed or change your ISO just by rotating that ring. What I'm trying to say is that it's very thought through and Canon is definitely viewing RF as the future. So if you were to make the switch to Canon mirrorless, whether it be a Canon R, R6, or an R5 or whatever's coming down the line, they will have you covered in the lens department. But, give it some time because they're still pretty expensive. And because you have those really intense recording modes, 8K, 4K 120, you have to use a card that can keep up with it. And it feels like I'm plugging in an external hard drive into this thing because it basically costs that much. The card that I'm using is only 128 gigs and still cost over $200. After a lens, filters, memory cards, and not to mention you probably have to get another external hard drive just to store all of these really fat, juicy files. Yeah, it really adds up. That is the biggest con out of this thing. The recording modes work perfectly fine. The photography is just beautiful. I'm a big fan. But the biggest con is that this thing is not cheap. And that is why a lot of people have moved over to the R6 instead to save a few $1,000s and then take that money and put it into lenses. And, that is not a bad way to go at all. If video isn't really your thing, or if you just want to dabble but still have a camera that provides really good quality and Canon colors, blah, 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 the R6 isn't a bad way to go either. I will say, if you can afford the R5, I don't regret it at all. And like I said, I'm so excited that I have such a future-proofed camera with technology finally catching up to the full capabilities of the R5. I'm super stoked and excited. I think every penny spent on this setup has been worth it. If you like this video, please like it. It actually makes a difference. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.